Imagine a general so consumed by his own legend that he walked into a military hospital, found a soldier sitting quietly among the wounded, and slapped him across the face in front of nurses, doctors, and traumatized men, not once, but twice, on two separate occasions, weeks apart, and somehow believed he had done nothing wrong. This is not a tale of fiction or dramatization. This happened. It happened in Sicily in the summer of 1943, during one of the most critical Allied campaigns of World War II, and the man who did it was General George S. Patton, Jr., one of the most brilliant and most dangerous military minds the United States Army had ever produced. What followed was a crisis that reached the highest levels of command, threatened to end Patton's career permanently, forced Dwight D. Eisenhower into one of the most difficult decisions of his life, and eventually landed on the desk of a man who was not yet president but would soon be, Harry S. Truman, then a senator from Missouri, who heard what had happened and responded in a way that revealed everything about the brutal politics of war, power, and reputation. If you've never heard this story in full, if you only know the slap but not the silence, the cover-up, the cables, the political calculations, and the human cost behind every decision that followed, then stay right here, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history. Because what you're about to hear is one of the most explosive and morally complex episodes in the entire history of American military leadership, and it has never been more relevant than it is today. To understand why the slapping incident shook the foundations of Allied command, it is necessary to understand who George Patton was in August of 1943 and what was at stake in Sicily at that precise moment. The Allied invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky, had begun on July 9th and 10th of 1943, and it was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. A staggering operation involving 160,000 troops, nearly 3,000 ships, and coordination between American, British, and Canadian forces across an island defended by German and Italian divisions that refused to collapse easily. Patton commanded the American 7th Army and was engaged in a fierce, almost obsessive competition with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who led the 8th Army. Patton believed, not without justification, that the British were receiving preferential treatment in terms of strategic objectives, and he drove his men at a punishing pace to prove that American soldiers were the equal, if not the superior, of any force on the battlefield. By early August, the 7th Army had swept across western Sicily with breathtaking speed, and Patton was on the verge of capturing Messina, the strategic prize of the entire campaign, before Montgomery could reach it. The general was riding an enormous wave of military success, and in his mind, anything that slowed that momentum, including soldiers who could not keep up, was not merely a problem, but a betrayal. It was in this psychological state, in this atmosphere of relentless forward pressure and barely controlled fury, that Patton walked into the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily, on August 3, 1943. He had made it a personal habit to visit the wounded, and his intentions were always framed as morale-boosting. He wanted his men to see their commander standing among them, acknowledging their sacrifice. But on that afternoon, he encountered Private Charles H. Cole, a 24-year-old soldier from Mishawaka, Indiana, who was sitting on a box near a tent, not visibly bleeding, not bearing any obvious physical wound. Patton asked him what was wrong. Cole told him he was nervous, that he just couldn't take it anymore. The general's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He began to shout, calling Cole a coward, a disgrace to the army, and several other terms that made the nurses and doctors in the area freeze in disbelief. Then Patton slapped Cole across the face with his glove. He grabbed him by the collar and physically dragged him toward the tent entrance, kicking him as he pushed him outside, shouting that he would not have yellow-bellied bastards receiving treatment alongside men who had been truly wounded. What Patton did not know, or perhaps did not care to know, was that Cole had a temperature of 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. He had malaria. He also had chronic diarrhea and had been diagnosed with exhaustion. He was not a coward. He was a sick man who had been fighting in brutal heat for weeks. 11 days later, on August 10th, Patton did it again. This time he was visiting the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, and he encountered Private Paul G. Bennett, a 21-year-old soldier from South Carolina who had served without incident through the entire North African campaign and had been with his unit through Sicily. Bennett was crying. He was suffering from what the Army then called battle fatigue, a condition we would recognize today as combat-induced psychological trauma, the forerunner of what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Bennett had not wanted to be evacuated. He had asked to stay with his unit. His battery commander had personally ordered him to the hospital because the soldier was in crisis. None of this mattered to Patton. The general, upon seeing Bennett's tears, erupted again. He called him a coward, slapped him with such force that his helmet liner was knocked off, then drew his pistol and waved it in the air, shouting that he ought to shoot Bennett himself for his cowardice. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin Long, the medical officer present, later filed a detailed report describing the incident in clinical and damning terms. The report made clear that Patton had committed a serious violation of military conduct, that he had struck an enlisted man, which was not merely a breach of etiquette, but a violation of the Articles of War. The report went up the chain of command, and it landed exactly where it needed to land, on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Mediterranean. Eisenhower received the first report about the August 3rd incident on August 16, 1943, and his response revealed the extraordinary pressure he was under from every conceivable direction. He was not a man without moral clarity. Eisenhower understood perfectly well that what Patton had done was wrong, that it was potentially criminal, and that it had caused real harm to real soldiers. But he was also a supreme commander in the middle of a war, and Patton, whatever his personal failings, was one of the most effective offensive generals the Allied powers possessed. The 7th Army had just completed its remarkable sweep of Sicily. Patton had taken Messina on August 17th, beating Montgomery to the prize by hours and delivering an enormous propaganda victory to the American war effort. Eisenhower wrote Patton a letter, a private letter, not a formal reprimand, that was withering in its directness. He told Patton that the behavior described in the reports was despicable and beneath the dignity of any officer. He told him that he would have to personally apologize to the soldiers he had struck, to the medical personnel who had witnessed the incidents, and to the units involved. He also told Patton, with unmistakable clarity, that if any future incident of this kind occurred, Eisenhower would have no choice but to relieve him of command and send him home. The letter was private, the apologies were arranged, and Eisenhower made a deliberate decision not to forward the matter to Washington. Not yet. But secrets of this magnitude, in a theater of operations filled with correspondence, do not stay secret forever. 3 American journalists, Demery Bess of the Saturday Evening Post, Merrill Mueller of NBC, and Quentin Reynolds of Collier's Weekly, had all independently heard about one or both of the slapping incidents through their contacts in the Army. They went to Eisenhower directly in late August and informed him that they possessed the story and were considering publishing it. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary acts of press management in the history of wartime journalism. Eisenhower met with the correspondents personally and made an appeal, not a legal threat, not a censorship order, but a direct human appeal. He told them that publishing the story would destroy Patton's ability to command, that it would benefit the enemy by eliminating one of the most feared American generals from the field, and that in his judgment, the interests of the war effort outweighed the public's right to know about the incident at that precise moment. All 3 journalists agreed, individually and voluntarily, to sit on the story. It was a suppression agreed to by free men, not imposed by authority, and it held, with remarkable discipline, for nearly 3 months. The story finally broke on November 21, 1943, when radio broadcaster Drew Pearson went on air and told the American public what Patton had done. Within hours, the silence was over, and the firestorm began. Now is the perfect moment to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with a friend who thinks they know World War II. Because the political fallout that followed Drew Pearson's broadcast goes deeper than most history books ever reveal. And the name Harry Truman is about to enter the story in a way that will surprise you. Leave a comment below and tell us, did you know about the journalists who chose to suppress this story for 3 months? The public reaction to Drew Pearson's November 21st broadcast was immediate and ferocious. Thousands of letters flooded the War Department, Congress, and newspaper offices. Some Americans were outraged. They had sons and brothers in uniform, and the idea that a general could strike an enlisted man without consequence struck them as a profound injustice, a violation of everything they believed the American military stood for. Others defended Patton with equal passion, arguing that war demanded hard men, that cowardice in the field endangered lives, and that Patton's record in Sicily spoke louder than any momentary lapse of discipline. Congress could not stay silent. Hearings were demanded. Statements were prepared. And it was in this explosive congressional atmosphere that Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri, chairman of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, known widely as the Truman Committee, was asked directly about his view of the incident and what he believed should happen to General Patton. Truman's committee had become one of the most powerful investigative bodies in Washington, having already saved the government an estimated $15 billion by rooting out waste, fraud, and mismanagement in the defense industry. Truman knew how to wield investigative authority, and everyone in Washington knew it. What Truman said, when pressed about the Patton slapping incident, was not what many expected from a man of his reputation for blunt moral judgment. Truman acknowledged that what Patton had done was wrong. He did not excuse it, and he did not pretend it was acceptable behavior for an officer of the United States Army. But Truman also made clear that he believed the matter had been handled through the proper chain of command, that Eisenhower had addressed it with appropriate severity, and that the decision about Patton's future should rest with military leadership, not with Congress and not with public opinion. Truman was not naive about Patton. He had no particular admiration for the general's theatrical style or his aristocratic self-mythology. But Truman was deeply practical about war, and he understood something that many of the outraged letter writers did not, that removing Patton from command in late 1943, at the precise moment when the Allied powers were preparing for the eventual invasion of Western Europe, would be a gift to the Axis powers that no amount of moral satisfaction could justify. His position was essentially this: the man was wrong, the man was punished through appropriate channels, and the war must go on. It was a position that prioritized outcome over outrage, and it was entirely consistent with the hard-headed strategic realism that would define Truman's approach to power for the rest of his career. Eisenhower, for his part, kept Patton on a leash that was tight and humiliating. For nearly a year following the slapping incidents, Patton was denied any active command. He was used as a decoy, deliberately placed in England during the build-up to D-Day, so that German intelligence would track his movements and conclude that the real invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. It was an extraordinary irony. The most aggressive combat general in the American Army spent the months before the greatest military operation in history being used as a human piece of disinformation. When Patton was finally given command of the Third Army in August of 1944, he broke out of Normandy with a speed and ferocity that stunned even his admirers, driving hundreds of miles across France in weeks and playing a decisive role in the Allied advance toward Germany. Private Charles Cole, the man Patton had struck on August 3, 1943, later said in interviews that he bore no lasting animosity toward the general, that he understood the pressure Patton was under, even if he could never quite excuse what had happened in that hospital tent in Sicily. Private Paul Bennett, the young soldier from South Carolina who had been slapped on August 10th, was far more deeply affected by the incident and carried the weight of it for years. The two men were footnotes in history, and yet they were also its human center, the faces behind the headlines, the soldiers who reminded the world that behind every strategic calculation, there were real human beings paying the cost. History does not always offer clean verdicts, and the story of George Patton, the slapping incidents of August 1943, Dwight Eisenhower's impossible choice, and Harry Truman's measured but revealing response is a story that refuses to resolve into simple heroes and villains. What it offers instead is something more valuable, a raw, unflinching look at how power operates under pressure, how military genius and moral failure can inhabit the same man simultaneously, and how the decisions made in the heat of crisis shape not just battles, but the entire architecture of history. Patton went on to become one of the most celebrated military figures of the 20th century. Eisenhower went on to become the 34th President of the United States. Truman, who watched all of this from the Senate and later from the White House, understood better than almost anyone that war is a machine that demands compromises no peacetime morality can fully prepare you for. The soldiers Patton struck were young men from Indiana and South Carolina who simply ran out of endurance. And they deserved better. The question of whether the right decisions were made, whether justice was truly served, whether the strategic calculus that protected Patton at the expense of accountability was ultimately worth its cost. That question does not belong to 1943. It belongs to right now, to every person watching this video, to every generation that inherits the consequences of choices made long before they were born. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, then please subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves the unfiltered truth of history, and leave a comment below telling us what detail surprised you most, because real history is never simple, and it is never finished.